Hey everyone, this is Jungkook. Before we start, I want to know where you're listening from. Drop your country in the comments below. I haven't said this anywhere else. Not on stage, not in interviews, not even in the moments when the cameras were off and everyone thought I was okay. But a few weeks ago, I was rushed to the ER. And it happened the same night I met my fiance's family for the first time. I didn't plan on talking about it publicly, but what I went through that night, it changed me. It forced me to look at my life, my body, my relationships, and the way I've been living. And if you're someone who pushes yourself until you break, this is for you. That night started like something out of a dream. I had been preparing for days. I barely slept the night before because I wanted everything to go perfectly. You know that nervous energy you get when you want to impress someone? Multiply that by 1,000, and that was me. I wasn't just meeting a family, I was meeting the people who raised the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And even though I perform in front of millions, this felt different. This wasn't a show. This was real. I remember sitting in the car, staring at my reflection in the window, my heart pounding like I was about to go on stage. Jimin texted me before I went inside. He said, "Breathe, bro. Just be yourself. They'll love you." I smiled, but something about that message made my chest tighten, because deep down, I didn't know if being myself was enough. I'd spent years being the version of Jungkook that people wanted to see, the artist, the perfectionist, the one who never cracks. But this was different. This was me trying to be a son-in-law, a man, a human being. The dinner started off fine. Her parents were kind. Her mom had this gentle smile that reminded me of my own. Her dad asked about BTS, and I laughed and told him some stories like the time Taehyung accidentally burned ramen during practice and tried to blame it on me. Everyone laughed. For a moment, it felt light, easy, but then something shifted. Her father asked me about the future, about marriage, family, kids, and how I plan to balance that with the life I live now. It wasn't an aggressive question. It was honest. But the truth is, I didn't have an answer. I've lived most of my adult life inside airports, studios, and concert halls. Every decision I've made has revolved around BTS, around ARMY, around the dream we built together. I started sweating. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. My chest felt tight, like my body was shrinking from the inside. I tried to smile, tried to say something like, "I'll figure it out," but my throat wouldn't cooperate. The room started spinning, and suddenly I couldn't hear anyone's voice clearly anymore. I remember Taehyung calling my name. I had put him on speaker earlier because he said he wanted to be moral support during dinner. His voice sounded far away. My hands went cold, trembling. My fiancée reached for me, but before I could even respond, my vision blurred. I could hear plates clinking, her mother gasping, someone shouting my name, and then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital room, hooked up to machines. My chest was covered in electrodes, and there was an IV in my arm. The air smelled like disinfectant and something metallic. I heard a faint beeping my heart monitor. For a second, I didn't even know where I was. My first thought was, I must have fainted. But then the doctor walked in, and the look on his face told me this was more serious than just passing out. He said my heart rate had spiked dangerously high, and my blood pressure had been through the roof when I arrived. They were worried it could have led to cardiac arrhythmia, something that can be fatal if not treated immediately. I was in what they call acute stress reaction. My body had gone into full survival mode. I stared at him confused. I've performed at global stages, jumped across arenas, danced through injuries, lived on 4 hours of sleep for weeks, and I thought I was fine, but that night, something inside me just snapped. I remember Namjoon walking into the hospital room later that night. He looked like he hadn't blinked in hours. He just sat beside me quietly for a while. Then he said, "You always think strength means pushing through, but sometimes it means stopping before you break." He didn't say much else, but those words hit me harder than any diagnosis could. As the hours passed, I couldn't stop thinking about how I got here. I thought about how often I'd ignored the signals, the headaches, the fatigue, the irritability. I thought about how I'd normalized living in pain because it was part of the grind. Yoongi had warned me about it years ago. He told me, when your body starts whispering, listen before it starts screaming. I laughed back then. Now I understood. The whisper had turned into a scream. The doctor came back the next morning, a woman, maybe in her 40s, with calm eyes and a voice that could make anyone trust her. She told me that my cortisol levels were through the roof. My body had been in a constant state of fight or flight for months. I asked her if it was because of the stress from work. She said, "It's not just your schedule, it's how you carry it." That sentence stayed with me because she was right. It wasn't only about overworking. It was about the pressure I put on myself to never disappoint anyone, my family, the members, the fans, the world. She said something else that changed everything for me. Your body doesn't know the difference between emotional danger and physical danger. It reacts the same way. I had been living like I was under attack by expectations, by fear of failure, by the need to prove myself, and my body finally shut down to protect me from me. Later that day, J-Hope showed up, bringing snacks I couldn't eat yet. He grinned like he always does, trying to lighten the room, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "You scared us, man," he said quietly. "You scared her family too." I laughed weakly and said I was fine, but even my voice didn't sound convincing. He told me something that stuck. "You've been running on fumes for years. Maybe this is life forcing you to refill." 3 days in that hospital felt like 3 months. The first day, I couldn't stop thinking about work. The rehearsal I was missing, the emails piling up, the projects waiting for approval. The nurses took my phone away because my blood pressure spiked every time I looked at it. By the second day, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: silence. No alarms, no pressure, no audience, no schedule. Just me, lying there, forced to exist without performing. I started thinking about the members, how we've all been through different versions of burnout, but we never called it that. We just called it being busy. Taehyung once told me during tour, "You can't take care of fans if you don't take care of yourself first." I nodded then, but I didn't live by it. Now it echoed in my mind like a warning I had ignored too many times. On the third day, the doctor came in again and said something that made me sit up literally and emotionally. She said, "You're still young, Jungkook, but your body doesn't care about age if you keep treating it like this. You might not get another warning next time." Her words hit me harder than any physical pain. Because I realized that night at dinner could have been the last normal moment of my life. One wrong heartbeat, and it could have been over. I thought about my parents, how proud they are, how they always worry quietly behind their smiles. I thought about Army, the millions of people who see me as strong, untouchable, unstoppable. And for the first time, I realized how dangerous that image can be. Because when you start believing you're invincible, you forget you're human. That hospital bed became a mirror. It reflected everything I'd been avoiding: the sleepless nights, the self-criticism, the emotional weight I carry silently. It showed me that even when your life looks perfect from the outside, it can be falling apart inside. I started making small changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing Instagram worthy. I started eating properly, not just when someone reminded me. I started walking every morning instead of rushing straight to the studio. I started saying no more often, even to things that seemed important. I started letting myself rest without guilt. It's crazy how rest used to feel like failure to me. Now it feels like survival. There were nights after I got discharged when I still woke up anxious, feeling like I had to do something, fix something, be somewhere. But I'd remind myself of that hospital beeping sound, that rhythmic pulse that meant I was still here, still alive, still given another chance. Taehyung called one night while I was recovering. He said, "You know what's funny? We always tell fans to take care of themselves, but we forget to do it too." We both laughed, but it wasn't really funny. It was the kind of laugh you do when you realize how close you came to losing something you didn't even know you were taking for granted. I know people see BTS as unstoppable, like we're powered by some supernatural energy, but the truth is, we're all just people trying to keep our hearts beating while the world watches. Sometimes that means learning the hard way that you can't keep giving from an empty cup. Looking back now, that night meeting her family wasn't a disaster. It was a revelation, because it wasn't just my body collapsing, it was my old mindset breaking down. The one that told me love means proving your worth, that success means never stopping, that rest means weakness. I had to break to see what really mattered. The doctor told me something before I left. Your body only has one language: signals. You can ignore them for a while, but eventually it will make you listen. That's what happened to me. My body forced me to listen, and maybe that's what I needed all along. So if you're watching this and you've been ignoring your own signals, the exhaustion, the headaches, the anxiety, I'm begging you to listen now before it screams. Don't wait for a hospital bed to remind you that you're human. Don't wait for your heart to say enough. Because one day, when the lights go off and the stage is quiet, all you'll have left is your body, your mind, your peace. Protect them. They're the only things you truly own. And if you've ever wondered what I learned from all of this, it's simple. Strength isn't about how much you can take before you break. It's about how much you can love yourself enough to stop before you do. So yeah, that's what really happened that night. And maybe, just maybe, it saved my life. When I got home from the hospital, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place I hadn't really been living in, more like a hotel room I passed through between flights. There were unopened packages stacked in the hallway, letters from fans I hadn't had the time to read, half-finished songs on my desk. Everything looked familiar but distant, like my life had been running on autopilot and I was suddenly seeing it with new eyes. I sat on the couch in silence for almost an hour that night. No music, no phone, no TV. Just silence. It's strange how uncomfortable silence can be when you've been surrounded by noise your whole life: applause, interviews, cameras, cheers, even your own thoughts that never stop talking. That night, silence felt heavier than any concert crowd I've ever faced. I looked at my phone. There were messages from all the members. Taehyung sent a voice note that said, "Don't even think about working. Seriously, I'll tell on you." I laughed a little because that's exactly what he would say. Jimin had written a long message too. He told me that when he heard I collapsed, his first thought was, of course he did. He said he wasn't surprised because he's seen me run myself into the ground before, during rehearsals, tours, recording sessions, and every time I said, "I'm fine," this time, I wasn't. The next morning, my fiancée came over. I could tell she was trying to hide how shaken she was. She brought porridge, the kind my mom always makes when I'm sick. She didn't say much, just sat next to me, held my hand, and whispered, "You scared me." I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who saw you collapse in front of her parents? I just said, "I scared myself too." Later that week, I got a call from Jin. He was filming something overseas, but still found time to check in. He said, "I heard what happened. You know, being the youngest doesn't mean you have to be the strongest." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit hard. I've always had that youngest kid mentality, the one that wants to prove he can handle everything, that he's not just the baby. But maybe that's exactly what broke me. During those first few days of recovery, I had to face something I had been avoiding for years: the fear of slowing down. I realized that I tied my entire identity to productivity, that if I wasn't creating, performing, or perfecting, then I was failing. But lying in bed, too dizzy to even stand up, I had to ask myself, failing who? I started journaling, something I used to think was unnecessary. Every morning, I wrote whatever came to mind. Sometimes it was a memory from trainee days, sometimes a lyric I never finished, sometimes just a sentence like, "I'm still tired." It sounds small, but it helped. It was like having a conversation with myself, the version I'd been ignoring. Namjoon visited one afternoon with a book. Of course, it was a philosophy book, something about balance and self-awareness. He told me, "You've been living like your body is just a machine for music, but it's not. It's your home." That word home stuck with me because for years, my home wasn't a place. It was the stage, the sound of the crowd, the lights. I built my sense of peace around things that were temporary. And when those things stopped, I didn't know where to exist. I remember the first time I tried to get back into singing after the hospital. My voice cracked halfway through a song, not because I lost skill, but because I was still exhausted inside. I stopped and just sat there, staring at the microphone. That same microphone that had heard every version of me: confident, insecure, tired, joyful, broken. For the first time, I didn't want to prove anything to it. I just wanted to breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about the members, all the times I saw them break in their own ways. Yoongi with his shoulder injury, J-Hope pushing through rehearsals even when his back hurt, Namjoon staying up rewriting lyrics for hours because he wasn't satisfied, Jimin practicing choreo until his knees gave out, Jin pretending to be okay while carrying more than he showed, Taehyung hiding behind his jokes when something bothered him. We've all had our hospital moments, physical or emotional. Maybe this was mine. I realized something else that night, something that scared me and freed me at the same time. Success doesn't protect you. It only hides your wounds better. People see fame as armor, but sometimes it's a disguise. You smile on stage, you talk about gratitude, and everyone thinks you're untouchable. But the truth is, even the brightest lights can burn you if you stay too close for too long. A few days later, my fiancé's father came to visit. I didn't expect that. He walked in holding a fruit basket, very formal, very traditional. He sat down and said, "You didn't have to collapse to make an impression." We both laughed, but then his tone softened. "You know, when you live with pressure every day, your body keeps score. It remembers what your mind tries to ignore." He told me he used to work as a surgeon, that he'd seen countless people like me, successful, driven, perfectionists who thought burnout was just a mental thing. But he said it's physical. The body always wins, he told me. If you don't rest by choice, you'll rest by force. I think that conversation changed the way I saw him, not as my fiance's father, but as someone who'd lived through the same illusions I had. And maybe that's why I needed to meet him, not to impress him, but to learn something from him. Around the same time, Jimin came over and stayed the night. He brought his guitar, said he wanted to check my heartbeat through music. We ended up talking for hours, not about fame or work, but about fear. He told me that he sometimes wakes up terrified that one day we'll all stop being BTS, that people will move on, that the love will fade. I told him I felt the same, and maybe that's why we push ourselves so hard, because deep down, we're scared to stop. He said something I'll never forget. You can't hold love by exhausting yourself. It's not earned that way. And for the first time, I understood. All these years, I thought being perfect was how I showed love to fans, to family, to everyone. But maybe love isn't about doing more. Maybe it's about being present enough to feel it. Every morning, I started walking outside, no phone, no music, no destination, just walking. At first, it felt useless, like I was wasting time. But slowly, I began noticing things I hadn't in years: the sound of birds, the way sunlight hits the pavement, the smell of coffee shops. It sounds simple, but after years of seeing the world only through camera lenses and backstage hallways, it felt like breathing real air again. Hosok joined me one morning. We didn't talk much, we just walked. He looked at me at one point and said, "You look different." I asked, "Different how?" He said, "You look like you're finally here." I didn't fully understand it then, but I do now. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing the next thing. I was just existing. I started visiting the studio again, but with no agenda. Some days I just sit there and listen to old demos. Some of them were from before BTS even debuted. I heard my younger voice, that raw, innocent tone full of hunger and fear. I started crying without realizing it. That kid had no idea what was coming. No idea about the fame, the awards, the chaos, and maybe he also didn't know how much it would cost. I began to see that hospital moment as more than just a warning. It was a reset. My body had drawn a line I couldn't ignore anymore, and maybe it wasn't punishment. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was life's way of saying, "You've done enough pretending. Now just live." I remember one afternoon, my mom came to see me. She sat beside me quietly for a long time. Then she said, "You used to sing just because it made you happy, not because the world expected it." Her words broke me because she was right. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that music was supposed to heal, not hurt. That evening, I went to my piano and played the same melody I'd been humming since I was a teenager, a simple tune I never finished. And as I played, I felt something release inside me. Not relief, exactly. More like forgiveness. I forgave myself for collapsing. I forgave myself for chasing perfection. I forgave myself for thinking rest was weakness. And that forgiveness felt heavier than exhaustion, but lighter than guilt. There are still days I feel that tightness in my chest, not from fear, but from memory. A reminder of that night at the dinner table, of the way everything went dark for a few minutes that felt like eternity. And whenever it happens, I remind myself it's not weakness to pause, it's wisdom. I know I'll go back on stage again, maybe sooner than people think. I'll sing, I'll dance, I'll give everything like I always have. But next time, I'll know when to stop before the world has to stop me. Because no award, no stage, no headline is worth losing yourself. If I could talk to anyone watching this who's on the edge of burnout, I'd say this: your body is not your enemy, it's your ally. It's the part of you that fights to keep you alive when your mind says keep going. Listen to it, respect it, and if you love someone who works too hard, tell them this: you don't admire them for their exhaustion. You admire them for their existence, because sometimes just existing is the bravest thing you can do. That's what I learned the hard way. And maybe, if I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have ended up in that hospital. But maybe I needed to, so I could finally start living like I deserve to stay here. After the hospital and all the quiet days that followed, I started noticing things I used to ignore, the way my body reacted to small things, the thoughts that used to rush past me without staying long enough to be understood. It was like life had been running at 200 miles an hour, and now, suddenly, I could see individual frames instead of just a blur. But with that clarity came something heavier. Guilt. You'd think that surviving something like that would instantly make you grateful, make you feel reborn. But that's not how it works. The first few weeks after the collapse were filled with self-blame. Every time I woke up feeling better, there was this voice in my head saying, "You did this to yourself." I kept replaying the moment. I felt the sound of my fiancée calling my name, the panic in her parents' eyes, the ambulance siren. I lie awake at night thinking, what if that had been the end? I tried to tell myself it was just stress, that it happens to everyone. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was years of ignoring the warning signs. Years of living like my body was disposable. Like sleep and peace were luxuries I hadn't earned yet. I thought about how many times people told me to slow down, my members, my parents, even fans, and how I always smiled and said, "I'll rest later." Later never came, until my body forced it. One morning, I called Namjoon and asked him how he deals with guilt. He laughed softly, like he'd been waiting for that question. "You don't deal with it," he said. "You forgive it." He told me that guilt is what happens when your heart wakes up after being asleep too long. "It's a good thing," he said. "It means you care enough to want to do better." That same day, Jimin came over again. He brought coffee and that same calm energy he always carries. We sat outside on the balcony while the city moved quietly below us. He said, "You know, when you were in the hospital, everyone was scared, but no one was surprised. We've all been waiting for you to crash, Jungkook. You've been going too hard for too long." I asked him why no one told me sooner. He looked at me and said, "Because every time we tried, you called it motivation." That line hit me. I always thought I was being passionate, disciplined, driven. But maybe I was just scared. Scared that if I stopped moving, everything I built would fall apart. The world only celebrates the grind, not the pause. But no one tells you that the pause is what keeps the grind from killing you. A few days later, I visited the practice room for the first time since the collapse. It was empty. The mirrors were dusty. The floor still had faint marks from our last rehearsal. I stood there for a long time, staring at my reflection, the same one I've seen thousands of times. But this time it looked different. I didn't see the perfectionist idol who needed to prove something. I saw a person who almost disappeared trying to be that. I started dancing slowly, not to rehearse, but to remember why I loved it. No cameras, no counts, no choreography, just movement. At one point, I stopped and sat on the floor, breathing hard. I realized I wasn't out of shape. I was out of connection. Somewhere between stages and perfection, I forgot that my body was more than an instrument. It was home. Later that evening, Yoongi called. He rarely calls, so when he does, it means something. He said, "You know, the body always remembers. Every sleepless night, every skipped meal, it adds up." He told me about his own burnout during tour years ago, when he couldn't sleep for days. "I kept pretending I was fine because I didn't want to be the weak link," he said. "But weakness isn't the problem, denial is." I stayed silent for a while, then said, "I think I've been denying a lot of things." He replied, "Then stop. Start telling the truth, even if it's only to yourself." That night, I wrote that sentence on a piece of paper and taped it above my desk. Start telling the truth. The next few weeks became a kind of slow healing. My fiancé and I talked a lot, sometimes about the future, sometimes about the past, sometimes about nothing. She told me she'd been worried about me long before that dinner night, but she didn't know how to say it without sounding like she was trying to change me. I told her she wasn't wrong to worry. I needed someone to remind me that I'm human. There was one evening, though, that broke me in a different way. I was watching an old BTS concert video, one of our biggest shows. I saw myself smiling, jumping, singing like nothing in the world could touch me. But I remembered how that night actually felt. The exhaustion, the pain in my chest, the way I almost fainted backstage, but went back out anyway. Watching it now, I didn't see passion. I saw a man pretending to be invincible. That realization hurt more than any diagnosis, because I realized how much of my life had been performance, not just on stage, but off it too. Smiling when I was empty, saying I was happy when I was drowning, carrying everyone's expectations while ignoring my own needs. It's a strange thing when you're loved by millions but can't remember how to love yourself. Joseo came to visit again. He brought a speaker and said, "Let's dance a bit." I told him I wasn't ready, but he insisted. He played a slow song, nothing complicated. He said, "Just move however your heart wants." So we did. For a few minutes, it felt like being trainees again, two kids dancing, not for applause, but because it made sense of the world. When the song ended, he said, "You see, you didn't lose it. You just buried it under all the pressure." Jin called the next morning. His voice was light, but I could hear the concern underneath. He said, "You've always been the one who gives everything. Maybe now it's time to let others give something back." It sounded simple, but it made me cry. I've never been good at receiving compliments, help, love. I always felt safer giving, because when you give, you're in control. But when you receive, you're vulnerable. And that's what I'd been avoiding, vulnerability. One night, Namjoon sent me a message that said, "We used to dream about making history. Maybe now the dream is just to stay alive long enough to enjoy it." I read that line over and over because he was right. What's the point of success if you're too tired to feel it? I began noticing how my definition of strength was changing. It used to mean enduring pain, pushing limits, never complaining. Now it meant something quieter, saying no, taking breaks, admitting fear. I started realizing that rest isn't the opposite of work. It's part of it. A few weeks later, I went to see Taehyung. He was filming something, but he made time. We sat on his studio couch for hours, just talking about everything and nothing. He said, "You know, we all thought you'd be the last one to fall. You're always the strong one, the one who keeps going." I told him, "That's the problem. I kept going when I should have stopped." He nodded slowly. That's how I felt when my voice gave out last year. I kept singing until I couldn't. Sometimes silence teaches louder than sound. That sentence stayed with me for days. Silence teaches louder than sound. Maybe that's why I had to collapse to finally listen to the silence I'd been drowning out. During recovery, I started journaling every night. One entry still stands out. Maybe I collapsed, not because I was weak, but because I was finally ready to heal. I think that's the truth. My body was trying to save me from myself. By the time I felt ready to see everyone again, the members decided to meet at the old practice studio, the one where it all started. Walking into that room after everything felt surreal. It still smelled the same, that mix of sweat, wood, and nostalgia. We sat in a circle. No cameras, no stylists, no schedules. Just 7 people who had built a life together and almost lost pieces of themselves along the way. Namjoon said, "We've all burned out before, but we always came back. The difference now is that we know why." Jimin nodded. Yoongi said quietly, "We know how fragile we are. That's not a weakness. That's our proof of being alive." We talked about how fame had changed us. how it had given us everything and taken other things quietly. But more than that, we talked about the future, not as performers, but as people. For the first time, it wasn't about what we'd achieve next, but how we'd live. Before we left, Hoseok said, "Promise me this none of us ends up in a hospital again for trying too hard." We all laughed, but there was a weight to that promise, because we all knew it could happen again if we didn't mean it. That night, I went home and called my fiancée. I told her that meeting her family, even though it ended the way it did, changed me. I told her that I don't want to impress anyone anymore. I just want to be honest. She said, that's all they ever wanted. And for the first time, I believed it. Sometimes people think collapse means the end, but maybe it's just the body's way of beginning again. I don't regret that night anymore. I see it as the night my heart finally spoke louder than my ego. And if you're listening to this right now, maybe it's your reminder too, to stop before you break, to rest before you crash, to breathe before your body has to beg for it. You don't need to end up in a hospital to deserve peace. You just need to give yourself permission to have it. Because peace isn't something you find when everything's perfect. It's what you learn to create when everything isn't. And that, I think, is what living really means. After everything that happened, I started realizing that healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't some big cinematic moment where I'd wake up one morning and everything felt perfect again. It was slower than that, more complicated. Some days I felt stronger. Some days I woke up and still felt that same heaviness in my chest, like my body was trying to remind me how close I came to losing control. I thought the hospital stay was the hard part, but what came after was harder, learning how to live differently. I had to learn how to slow down, and that sounds easy until you try it, because slowing down isn't just about doing less. It's about unlearning the habit of tying your worth to how much you produce. I'd been trained for years to move fast, to push through, to always have something new ready for the world. So when I wasn't doing that, I felt guilty. I'd wake up late, drink my coffee slowly, and my brain would whisper, "You're falling behind." I had to fight that voice every single day. There were mornings when I'd sit on the balcony, watching people go to work, and I'd think about all the times I'd miss moments like that, the sound of the city waking up, the quiet before the chaos. I used to think rest was boring. Now I realized it was sacred. My fiancée would come by often. We didn't talk much about what happened that night anymore, but I could tell it still haunted her. One evening, she told me something I didn't expect. She said, "When you fainted, my dad froze. He didn't move for a full minute. I think he saw himself in you." That line hit me hard. Her dad, a surgeon who probably spent decades under stress, watching someone my age crumble under pressure, maybe it reminded him of all the people who didn't get a second chance. Later that night, I wrote something in my journal. Sometimes it takes breaking in front of others to finally stop pretending you're unbreakable. Around that time, RM organized a small get-together for us, not a BTS meeting, just a simple dinner. He said it was time we talked as brothers, not coworkers. We met at this quiet restaurant in Seoul that had private rooms. I remember walking in and seeing all their faces again. It felt strange, like I was looking at different versions of myself in each of them. Jin was his usual calm self. Yoongi had that quiet intensity. Hoseok smiled the moment he saw me. Taehyung waved dramatically, and Jimin just hugged me without saying a word. Namjoon raised his glass halfway through dinner and said, "Let's not talk about work tonight. Let's talk about life." We laughed, but he meant it. We started sharing stories about when we realized life was moving too fast. Jin talked about his time in the military, how the silence there made him rethink what success really means. Yoongi talked about the moment he realized music isn't about proving skill but expressing truth. Jimin talked about fear, about how even love can be scary when you don't know how to slow down for it. When it was my turn, I hesitated. Then I said, I realized I've been afraid of peace because peace meant I wasn't achieving anything. Everyone went quiet. Then Namjoon nodded and said, yeah, that's the sickness of our generation. We laughed about small things after that, but there was something healing about just being together. No cameras, no deadlines, no pressure. At one point, Hoseok looked at me and said, you seem lighter. I smiled and said, maybe because I finally stopped fighting gravity. After that night, I made it a ritual to see at least one member every week. Sometimes it was just for coffee, sometimes for late night drives. Taehyung liked to drive around aimlessly while playing music. One night we drove through the Han River Bridge in silence. The city lights reflected on the water like 1,000 little reminders that life keeps moving even when you don't. He said, do you ever think we'll be normal again? I asked, what's normal? He shrugged. Maybe just waking up without the world watching. I didn't know how to answer, but I thought about that question for days. The truth is, maybe we'll never be normal, not in the way most people mean it. But maybe that's okay. Maybe what we can be is human. I started spending more time at my parents' house too. My mom would cook way too much food and scold me for not eating enough. My dad, usually quiet, just watched me with that mix of pride and concern that only parents have. One night, he said, you know, when you were a kid, you used to sing for hours without caring who was listening. I miss that version of you. I told him I missed him too, not just as a father, but as a mirror to who I was before the noise. The more I slowed down, the more memories came back. I remembered training days sleeping in studios, eating ramen at 3 a.m., laughing at nothing with the members, because we were too tired to care. I remember the first time we performed in front of a small crowd and how the applause felt like thunder. And I remember the first time I realized fame doesn't fix you, it just amplifies what's already inside. During recovery, I also met with a therapist. That's something I used to avoid. In our culture, sometimes people still see therapy as a sign of weakness, especially for men. But my doctor at the hospital insisted. The therapist told me that what I experienced wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was emotional depletion. You've been living in performance mode for too long, she said. Even when you're resting, you're preparing. That hit me because it was true. Even when I took breaks, I wasn't really resting, I was just pausing to plan the next move. She taught me something simple but powerful. When you rest, rest completely. That means no guilt, no planning, no multitasking your piece. Just be. The first time I tried that, it felt impossible. But over time, I learned to find stillness in small things, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain, the way my dog breathed beside me. I realized peace doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it hides in the details you ignore when you're too busy chasing big things. One afternoon, I went back to the hospital, not as a patient, but to thank the staff. Dr. Kang, the one who treated me, smiled when she saw me. She said, "You look alive." I told her about the changes I had made, sleeping more, eating better, walking every morning. She nodded and said, "Good, but don't do them because you almost died. Do them because you want to live." That line stayed with me for weeks. As I left, I passed by the same ER doors where I'd been rushed in that night. I stood there for a long time. It was strange that door represented both fear and mercy. I realized that night didn't ruin me. It rescued me. When I told my fiancée about the visit, she cried, not out of sadness, but relief. She said, "You finally sound like yourself again." And for the first time, I felt like it too. Life after that became less about fixing everything and more about feeling everything. I started writing again, not for an album, just for me. I wrote about silence, about light, about forgiveness. I wrote about the night I collapsed and how, in a strange way, it saved me from a slower kind of death, the one where you stop feeling without realizing it. Some nights, I go back to the studio alone, turn off all the lights, and play old recordings. There was one track I never released, something I made years ago at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. It was just me humming over a piano lute. Listening to it now, it felt like a message from my past self, a reminder that the simplest sounds are sometimes the truest. One evening, Jimin came by again. I guess he's become my unofficial life coach. We ordered food, watched a movie, didn't talk much. Toward the end, he said, "You know, the hardest part about healing is that no one applauds you for it." I laughed because it was true. There's no trophy for learning to rest. No trending hashtag for saying no. But maybe that's the point. Healing isn't supposed to be public. It's supposed to be personal. And yet, here I am, sharing this with you. Not because I want sympathy, but because maybe someone out there is on the same edge I was on, exhausted, scared, pretending to be fine. If that's you, I hope you listen before your body makes you. Because I promise you, the world won't fall apart if you take a break. It'll still be here when you come back, and you'll see it clearer than ever. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that night went differently, if I hadn't collapsed. Maybe I'd still be chasing perfection, still ignoring the signs, still calling stress passion. Maybe I needed to fall to realize that standing isn't living if your soul is tired. Now, when I meet new people, I don't tell them about achievements or awards. I tell them about the lessons I learned from breaking. I tell them that love means slowing down enough to be fully present. That success without peace is just noise. That gratitude means more when it's quiet. The other day, Taehyung texted me a picture of the sunset and said, "Don't forget to look up sometimes." I smiled because that's exactly the kind of thing he'd say. Random, poetic, perfectly timed. I looked up at the sky that evening and thought, maybe that's what life is. A collection of reminders to look up, to breathe, to notice. When I think about meeting my fiancé's family again, I don't feel anxious anymore. I feel thankful. Because that night didn't end our story. It started a new one. One where I don't have to be perfect to be loved. One where I can be human, flawed, tired, real, and still enough. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. You don't need to impress the people who already care about you. You just need to show up as yourself. That's all they ever wanted. That's all anyone really wants. Every day now, I wake up and say one sentence out loud. Thank you for another chance. It sounds simple, but it grounds me. Because for a long time, I didn't realize how close I was to losing that chance. I don't know what the future looks like for me, for BTS, for everything, but I know one thing. I'm not running toward it anymore. I'm walking, I'm breathing, I'm listening. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. The first time I went back into the studio after everything, it didn't feel like before. The air felt different, quieter, heavier, almost sacred. I stood there in the doorway for a few seconds, taking it all in, like I was entering a temple. The lights were dim, the speakers hummed faintly, and the smell of wood and old wires hit me like a wave of nostalgia. This room had seen everything. My beginnings, my failures, my exhaustion, my obsession. It had witnessed the version of me that thought love and rest were things you had to earn. I sat in front of the mic and just stared at it. That same mic that had carried my voice to millions of people. It looked the same, but I didn't. I wasn't sure if I was ready to sing again. It felt like singing would pull open something I wasn't ready to face. So instead of starting the track, I just whispered, "I'm still here." The words sounded strange in that quiet room, but they felt honest. For once, I wasn't performing. A few minutes later, Namjoon walked in. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked around and smiled. "Feels smaller now, doesn't it?" he said. I nodded. He sat down beside me, leaned back, and said, "That's because you grew." That line stayed in my head for days. Growth isn't always about getting bigger sometimes. It's about seeing the same space differently. He asked if I'd written anything since the hospital. I told him I'd written hundreds of words but no lyrics. "Then start there," he said. "Music will come when you stop trying to control it." After he left, I pulled out my notebook. I flipped through pages of thoughts, sentences about breathing, about time, about silence. One line caught my eye. "Healing doesn't look good on camera, but it feels like oxygen." I underlined it 3 times. Maybe that's what this new chapter was, learning how to breathe again. When I finally sang again, it wasn't perfect. My voice cracked, my tone wavered, but it felt raw and alive. It reminded me of when I first started, when it wasn't about fame or charts, just connection. For a second, I closed my eyes and imagined that I was singing to no one, just letting the sound exist. That moment felt pure. A few days later, Jimin dropped by while I was recording. He leaned against the wall, listening quietly. When I finished, he said, "You sound softer now." I asked if that was a bad thing. He shook his head. "No, you sound like you stopped fighting the song." I didn't realize how much I'd been fighting music, trying to control every beat, every breath. Maybe I've been fighting life the same way. Taehyung came by too a few days later. He brought food way too much, as usual, and said, "You need real fuel, not caffeine." He listened to the new demo and said, "This one feels like you." I smiled because for years, that's all I ever wanted, to sound like myself again. Yoongi heard the track later and said, "Don't polish it too much. Leave the cracks. People will feel that." I laughed because that's exactly what he would say. He's always been the one reminding me that imperfection is its own kind of truth. The next week, I had to do a small interview for a project that had been delayed because of my health. It was my first time facing cameras again since the hospital. The producer asked me if I was nervous. I said, "Not nervous, just aware." Aware of my body, my limits, my heartbeat. When the camera started rolling, I took a deep breath and said, "I used to think strength meant never stopping. Now I think it means knowing when to." The interview went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. People said they saw a different side of me, calmer, more grounded. But what they didn't see was the fear I still carried. The fear of slipping back into old habits. The fear that I'd start chasing perfection again the moment applause returned. That's the hardest part of recovery, the temptation to forget what almost broke you once you start feeling strong again. There were days I caught myself slipping, staying up too late in the studio, skipping meals because I was in the zone. And every time, that memory of the hospital came back like a whisper. "Don't make me remind you again." I started seeing my fiancé's family again too. The first dinner after the incident was awkward at first. Her mom hugged me a little too tight. Her dad tried to act casual, but kept glancing at me like he was checking my pulse with his eyes. Then, halfway through dinner, her little sister said, "You're the guy who fainted at our table." Everyone laughed and the tension broke. I laughed too, because honestly, that's who I was, the guy who fainted trying too hard to be perfect. And I was okay with that. After dinner, her father pulled me aside. He said, "I've seen patients come back after near burnout. Some return stronger, some repeat the same mistakes. The difference isn't in their bodies, it's in their mindset. I told him I didn't want to go back to the old mindset. He smiled and said, "Then make peace with being ordinary sometimes." That line hit deep. For someone who's lived his whole life being extraordinary, learning to be ordinary again felt revolutionary. Later that night, I told my fiancée I was scared that I might not know how to be normal. She said, "Normal isn't a goal, it's a rhythm. You'll find it when you stop forcing it." I didn't respond, but I think she was right. Healing is a rhythm too, one you can't dance to if you keep rushing the beat. Jin came back from his trip and invited me over for dinner at his place. He cooked, like he always does, and said, "You know what I realized while you were in the hospital? You remind me of myself when I was younger, always thinking you could carry the world alone." He handed me a bowl of stew and said, "The secret is you don't have to." That night, we talked for hours about everything: life, aging, marriage, family, purpose. At one point, he said, "Do you ever feel like we're running out of time?" I nodded. He said, "Then stop running. Time isn't chasing you." It's strange how simple words can undo years of conditioning. That's what I've been learning, that sometimes the answers we search for in books, songs, or endless thinking are already waiting in the simplest truths we avoid. A few weeks later, I had a dream. I was back at that dinner table, surrounded by her family, but this time I didn't faint. I just stood up, smiled, and said, "I'm tired." And instead of silence or judgment, they all smiled back and said, "Then rest." I woke up crying, not from sadness, but from release. Because that dream wasn't about them. It was about me finally giving myself permission to rest without guilt. After that, I began making small promises to myself. To stop saying yes when I meant no. To stop apologizing for needing time. To stop calling exhaustion dedication. I even set an alarm every night that says, "Breathe." It sounds silly, but sometimes that reminder is all I need to pause. Work slowly started picking up again, recordings, meetings, shoots, but this time I approached everything differently. I didn't try to fill every hour. I didn't try to say yes to every opportunity. I learned that saying no doesn't mean you're ungrateful, it means you understand your limits. During one rehearsal, I remember looking around at all the members laughing, teasing each other, messing up steps, and for once, I didn't feel pressure to perfect it. I just felt lucky to still be there. To still move, breathe, and laugh. I realized something that day. Maybe life isn't about chasing balance. Maybe it's about learning to fall and rise in harmony. Because we'll always fall to exhaustion, to fear, to overthinking, but if you rise with awareness, the fall becomes part of the rhythm. A few days later, I visited the Han River again. It was late at night, quiet, and the air was cool. I sat on the bench alone, watching the water move. It reminded me of time always flowing, never still, yet never rushing. I whispered to myself, "Be like that." I don't know what's next. I don't know how long this peace will last, but I know one thing. I'm not going back to who I was before. The version of me that equated exhaustion with purpose, that thought collapsing was the price of greatness, he's gone. And I'm not mourning him, I'm thanking him because he taught me how not to live. Now, every time I hold a microphone, I remember the hospital monitor, that slow, steady beep reminding me I'm still alive. Every song I sing now isn't for perfection, it's for gratitude. If you're watching or listening to this, maybe you need that reminder too, that your worth isn't in how much you can take, but in how gently you can return to yourself after breaking. Don't wait for a collapse to start living. Don't wait for silence to start listening, because one day you'll realize that the quiet moments, the ones without applause, without noise, without performance, those are the ones that save you. Those are the ones that teach you how to live. And maybe that's what all of this was about. Not punishment, not failure, but an invitation to begin again, softer this time. The comeback with the members was the moment I both feared and longed for. The studio lights, the cameras, the smell of sweat mixed with sound equipment, all of it felt familiar, almost like a memory I could touch. But standing there again, I realized I wasn't the same person who had collapsed months ago. I could feel it in my heartbeat, slower, steadier. I could feel it in the way I breathed before a song, not rushing, just allowing air to move through me like forgiveness. The first rehearsal was awkward. Everyone was trying not to make it obvious that they were watching me. Every time I stretched, Taehyung's eyes followed. Every time I bent too low, Jimin whispered, "Careful." I laughed, told them I wasn't glass, but deep down I was grateful. They cared in a way words couldn't describe. When the music started, something inside me shifted. My body remembered every move before my mind did. The rhythm hit, and suddenly I was back in the world that made me the world that almost broke me too. The difference was the intention. Before, I danced like I was running from something. Now I danced like I was finally free to feel. After the session, Hosok came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "You didn't push too hard today," he said, half proud, half teasing. "Progress." I smiled and said, "Maybe I'm finally learning from you." He grinned. "About time." That night, we all went out for dinner. It felt like old times, the kind where laughter came easy and conversations drifted from nonsense to deep philosophy without warning. Yoongi talked about how creativity and burnout share the same door. The difference is how long you stand outside before knocking. Namjoon said something that stuck with me. "We used to chase perfection like it was oxygen. Now we just want to breathe." I went home that night feeling full, not of food, but of gratitude. The kind that settles in your chest quietly, not the kind you post about. My fiancée was waiting for me. She asked how it went, and I told her it felt like coming home to a house that had been rebuilt. Stronger, wiser, softer. She smiled and said, "Then maybe it's time to invite peace to stay." Over the next few weeks, life started moving again, but this time, it didn't feel like a race. I began working on new music, not for release, just to explore. Songs that didn't need to be perfect, just honest. Some were about fear, some about love, some about nothing at all. It felt good to create without pressure, like painting without needing anyone to see the result. During one of those nights, Jimin came over. He listened to a rough demo and said, "It sounds like you're forgiving yourself." I didn't know that was even possible through a song, but maybe that's what art really is. A conversation between who you were and who you're becoming. A week later, we filmed a group interview. One of the questions was, "What did you learn about yourself during the break?" I hesitated, then said that I'm not a machine. I'm a person who loves, who hurts, who gets tired, who still dreams. There was a silence after I spoke, not awkward, just understanding. I looked around at the members and I knew they felt the same. After the shoot, Jim pulled me aside. "You know," he said, "there was a time when you wouldn't have admitted that." I smiled. "There was a time I didn't even believe it." He nodded. "That's growth." At home, I started writing a letter to my younger self. The boy who stayed up all night practicing vocals. The one who thought resting meant falling behind. The one who couldn't imagine disappointing anyone. I wrote, "You did your best. You don't have to keep proving you're worthy of love. You already are. When I finished, I folded the letter and left it on my desk. I didn't need to send it anywhere. It had already reached the right place. One weekend, I went with my fiancée to visit her family again. This time, there was no anxiety. Her mom cooked too much, her dad told old stories, and her little sister asked if I could teach her how to sing. We laughed, ate, and talked about everything except fame. It was peaceful. Before we left, her father said, "You seem healthier." I smiled and said, "I'm learning to be." He nodded, "Keep learning." On the drive home, my fiancée reached over and held my hand. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. Her silence said everything. "I'm proud of you. I see you." I looked out the window at the night sky, the city lights blurring softly, and thought, maybe this is what peace really feels like. Not an absence of noise, but a calmness inside it. A few days later, I met Namjoon again. We went for coffee, and he said something that I'll never forget. You know, the hardest part about recovery is not the pain. It's believing you deserve the peace that follows. I asked him if he thought I did. He said, "You're still here, aren't you? That means life hasn't given up on you. Don't give up on it." That night, I walked by myself through the quiet streets of Seoul. I passed by places that used to overwhelm me: billboards, cafes filled with people talking about BTS, shops playing our songs. But for the first time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like a reminder of how far we've come, how much we've survived. I used to think the biggest accomplishment was being seen by millions. Now I think it's being understood by yourself. That's a different kind of fame, the kind that doesn't fade when the lights go off. The members started noticing it too. J-Hope said during one rehearsal, "You're leading differently now. It's not about control, it's about presence." I laughed, but he was right. Before, I used to command every detail, every move, every breath. Now, I just focused on being there. Music started feeling lighter again. Performances stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like celebration. I even began sleeping before shows, something I used to think was impossible. My body finally stopped fighting me. It started working with me. When I talked to fans again, I was honest. I told them about the hospital, the stress, the breakdowns. And instead of judgment, I got messages from people who said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that." That's when I realized something powerful. Maybe sharing your weakness is its own kind of strength. The more I opened up, the more I healed. Every story I shared pulled out a little bit of the shame I didn't know I was carrying. Because shame thrives in silence, but it dies in truth. Now, when I think about that night, the night I collapsed, I don't see it as humiliation anymore. I see it as my body's way of saving my future. Because if that night hadn't happened, I might have kept pushing until something worse did. One morning, I woke up early, before sunrise. I went to the rooftop and watched the sky turn from blue to gold. The world was still quiet. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to do anything with the day. I just existed in it. I whispered, "Thank you," and I meant it. Maybe that's what this whole experience taught me. Gratitude isn't about counting blessings. It's about recognizing moments. The big ones, the small ones, even the painful ones. Because they're all pieces of the same puzzle, the story of how you became who you are. And if I could go back and talk to the version of me sitting at that dinner table trying to impress everyone, scared and exhausted, I'd tell him this: you don't need to prove that you belong. You already do. Just breathe. Just live. That's what I'm doing now. Living slower, softer, but more real than ever. There's something strange about recovery. Everyone talks about the beginning, the hospital, the pain, the fear, but no one talks about the middle. The middle is quiet, confusing, full of questions that don't have quick answers. You're no longer broken, but you're not whole yet either. You wake up feeling better, but you still hesitate before saying you're okay. That's where I've been living lately, somewhere between healing and becoming. Life has started to move again. Schedules are filling up, rehearsals are happening, interviews are being planned, but now I look at everything differently. Before, every event felt like a mountain I had to conquer. Now it just feels like part of the landscape of my life, something to walk through, not fight against. The biggest change, though, has been how I show up in front of ARMY. I used to feel like I had to give them everything, all my energy, my smiles, my best performance, even when I was running on empty. I thought that was what love looked like, giving until it hurt. But when I finally talked about the hospital, the exhaustion, the pressure, when I was honest, the response was different. The messages weren't about disappointment or worry. They were about understanding. People said things like, "We don't need you perfect. We just need you alive." That hit me hard because for the first time, I realized that maybe I'd been projecting my own fears onto everyone else. I thought people expected me to be superhuman, but maybe they were just reflecting what I expected of myself. I built that cage and called it purpose. A few weeks ago, we did a small fan meeting. Nothing huge, just a quiet gathering. I remember standing backstage, looking at the crowd faces, light sticks, signs, tears, smiles. My heart started racing, not from anxiety, but from gratitude. I thought about how many times I'd stood on a stage like that, not even feeling it because I was too busy being perfect. But that night, I felt every second. The warmth, the cheers, even the silence between songs. It was like the world had slowed down just enough for me to catch up to it. After the show, Taehyung hugged me and said, "You didn't perform tonight, you connected." And I think that's the best compliment I've ever received, because performance fades when the lights go out. Connection stays.